Bonjour à tous et bienvenue dans cette nouvelle vidéo de la Fabrique sociale. Aujourd'hui, j'ai eu le plaisir d'interviewer Peter Gray, qui est un professeur de psychologie au Boston College. Il a fait un travail que je trouve assez remarquable sur le rôle du jeu dans l'évolution de nos sociétés et sur l'éducation en général. J'ai quand même des petits désaccords avec lui sur l'impact qu'a pu avoir la technologie sur la santé mentale des jeunes ou sur l'éducation en général. On ferait ça un petit peu plus loin dans l'interview. Mais bon, c'est toujours important aussi d'avoir différentes perspectives sur un sujet. Avant de lancer l'interview, si vous souhaitez soutenir cette chaîne, n'hésitez pas à le faire via le lien Tipeee que je vais mettre dans les notes. C'est très important pour que la chaîne puisse survivre sur le long terme et je remercie infiniment les personnes qui ont déjà justement contribué à cette chaîne. Voilà, très bonne écoute. N'oubliez pas de boire de l'eau et ciao, ciao. Thank you very much, Peter, for being with us today and taking the time to discuss. Could you first maybe introduce yourself and maybe give us an overview of your work?
Sure. I'm Peter Gray. I'm a research professor of psychology and neuroscience at Boston College in the United States. I have for many years been researching and writing about children's play, especially, and about how play promotes all aspects, really, of children's healthy physical and mental development. I've been focusing on their psychological development through play. I've been for many, many years now concerned about the rise in anxiety, depression, even suicide among young people. And lately have been writing about what I believe to be the causes of those and what, as a society, we need to do to remedy this, to basically, as I would put it, often bring childhood back to children so that they can grow in a healthy way.
We have a general sense about the meaning of the words we use, but often we don't know their exact definition. And that can be misleading. So my question will be, what is your definition of play?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that. You're absolutely right. People use the word play to mean various things. A lot of words have various meanings, you know, and I think that's maybe especially true in English. I'm sure it's true in French also. the play, the way I define it, and the way many other play scholars define it, and I also think the way children kind of intuitively understand it is an activity that has the following characteristics. The first characteristic is that it is self-chosen and self-directed. It's something that the players choose to do themselves. They take the initiative about it and they direct it. If it's an activity that's run by some outside authority figure, so for example, an adult running a children's soccer team or a little league baseball team here in the United States, that doesn't fit my definition of play, even though we might say the children are playing baseball. So that's the first part of the definition is something children choose themselves to do and direct themselves. It's how children learn to choose things, how they learn to take initiative, and it's how they learn to direct their own activities and solve their own problems. Second defining characteristic of play is that it's something that is done for its own sake. In other words, it's intrinsically motivated. It's not something that you're doing for some reward outside of itself. You're not doing it to get a trophy or a gold star or an A on a report card or money or praise. You're doing it just because you want to do it, right? And so then, among other things, play is how children discover what they like to do and pursue what they like to do. It's how they develop competence in what they like to do. So that's the second defining character. The third defining characteristic, which surprises some people, but I think becomes obvious when you think about it, is that all play has rules. It's not just formal games with formal rules that have rules. All play, in some sense, has rules, or at least guidelines. All play is structured. People talk about unstructured play, but there's no such thing as unstructured play. Play is always structured. It's not a random activity. You're always doing something when you're playing. And that something is defined by certain boundaries, conditions that you have in your mind. If you're a little child, you're pretending to be a dragon. You're not just behaving randomly, you're behaving in a sense of what your sense of what it would be to be a dragon and to pretend to be a dragon. So whatever you're doing, you have in mind some guidelines about what you're doing, and you are behaving within those guidelines. So among other things, then, play is how children learn to inhibit their impulses and behave in accordance with a set of self-imposed guidelines about what they're doing. And it's not just self-imposed, because children also want to play. Children primarily want to play with other children, and so they have to reinforce the guidelines between themselves about what they're doing, how they're doing it. They have to negotiate and plan. And then if somebody's not playing according to the way they plan, they remind one another, hey, you know, you're supposed to be a dragon here, right? So that's and then the final characteristic is that although play has structure and rules, those rules are never so rigid that creativity doesn't occur. All play is creative. All play is play is the most creative thing that anybody ever does. It's always, you are creating the activity, you are creating the structure, you are creating, and within that structure, you're creating every move that you make. The guidelines about being a dragon don't tell you exactly what you have to do every moment in being a dragon, but then you make it up what you do, but within your general conception of what it is to be a dragon. So those are the defining characteristics of play.
Okay, thank you. And in your work, you talk about two distinctive social structures that are dominance hierarchies and egalitarian societies. Could you explain maybe the difference between the two?
Well, so as part of my research some years ago, I got interested in hunter-gatherer groups that have been studied, primarily studied in the middle part of the 20th century on to about 1980, which was a big time for anthropologists to trek out into sort of secluded parts of the world and make contact with people who were still living in the ways that many people, at least, if not most people, lived prior to the development of agriculture. And it turns out that wherever anthropologists, I got interested in this, I should say, because I was interested in how children learn and grow in those cultures. Presumably, those cultures are more similar to the way that human beings lived during most of human evolution. And so our basic instincts for play and other kinds of things would have come about under those conditions of living. I can't say for sure that most of our ancestors lived the way these band hunter-gatherers live that have been studied, but I'm sure that many of them did. And this was one of the ways of living that represented the background of our ancestors more than 10,000 years ago when agriculture first came about. So that was my reason for interest. And what I found when I delved into the writings on this and when I began to survey anthropologists who had lived among them is that every one of these bands that have been found is egalitarian in a sense that goes way, way beyond the French and American ideas about equality, right? Way beyond that. You know, they believe that if you own 2 shirts and somebody else doesn't own any, you are obliged to give them one of your 2 shirts. You know, that's egalitarianism in a real sense. And the bands depend upon sharing, upon cooperation for their survival. You have to cooperate. if you don't, if you're a band that hunts big game, only one or two families in the band is going to capture anything on any given day. So you've got to share. Otherwise, everybody else would die out, So sharing is essential. And as part of sharing, they have this egalitarian ethos, which is that everybody's equal here. Nobody's more important than anybody else. And they actively maintain that sense of equality. And I've argued in my writing that they do it in playful ways. If you act a little bit like an alpha male, what we call an alpha male, you act a little like you're a big shot, like I'm a great hunter. You say something like that, everybody's going to start mocking you. Oh, he thinks he's such a great hunter. Yeah, right. They'll tease you mercilessly about that until you decide, oh, this is silly. Of course, So they actively maintain this. They recognize, probably because of long experience with this, that anybody who thinks they're better than somebody else is dangerous to their way of living, and they can't tolerate that. They won't tolerate that. So that's the sense of egalitarianism. They don't have, and as part of this, and this was, even for me, this was hard to believe, but when I heard it over and over again, I began to have to believe it. They don't tell one another what to do. There's no chief, there's no big man in their group. They make decisions by long argument and consensus. As a result, the anthropologists say they're really good at arguing. They're really great debaters. And in fact, there's a side effect, but when Europeans first came to America and and some of the missionaries began to debate with the American Indians, they wrote back, these people are really good debaters, They can argue me down, they've argued me better than any European has about what my beliefs are and which beliefs are better, and so on and so forth. This is a characteristic of an egalitarian society. You can't force your opinions on people, so you have to use persuasion, and they become very good at persuasion. That's a little bit of a digression, but the point is that in these societies, they don't tell one another what to do, and most remarkably, this applies to children as well. They don't tell children what to do. Can you imagine raising children without telling them what to do? Without ordering them around, without saying, no, you can't do this, or, I'm sure there are some restrictions. They say don't eat those mushrooms, are poisonous. But beyond that, there's very little. Or if somebody begins to do something that seems a little bit violent, just as they will stop an adult from doing that, they will stop a child from doing that too. But they don't tell children how to spend their day, and the children spend their whole days playing and exploring and doing what they want. Not just playing, lying around in hammocks, hanging out, talking with one another, doing what children do. Getting into trouble and so on and so forth. But that's up to the children, and they believe that free will is the appropriate guide to everybody's life. So that's the egalitarian way of living. Now, of course, with agriculture, this is somewhat oversimplified, but with agriculture, people started having to own land, and land ownership brings a sedentary style of life, which means you can now begin to accumulate property. And once you own land, once all the land is owned in a given area, then there are some people who are dependent upon those who own the land. And so now you have hierarchy. You have landowners and you have those who aren't landowners. Ultimately, in Europe and Asia, you ultimately had feudalism, where all the land is owned by the kings, and everybody else is subservient to them, at least in principle. And that's where you have the extreme of a hierarchical society. And to some degree, we've been evolving away from that extreme culturally towards a bit more democracy, but we still have hierarchy. We may elect our president or elect our, our leaders, but our leaders are then still our leaders. And we have a rule of law that we don't necessarily all agree with, and we, at least on every point, and so on and so forth. So we've developed a somewhat more democratic attitude, and our beliefs have changed in some ways that fit that more democratic attitude. But we haven't even begun to approach the degree of democracy and egalitarian views that exist in these band hunter-gatherer societies.
Thank you. Really interesting. And I was wondering, is there any data available on the well-being of indigenous people or young people?
So I don't know of any studies where somebody has given young people the same kinds of questionnaires about anxiety and so on and so forth. But every anthropologist that I have talked with says these kids are extraordinarily happy. These kids are bright, they're inquisitive, they're curious. One anthropologist said that who was one of the first to study one of the most studied groups in her book she wrote, said, these children are every parent's dream. So it is. So this is what people come back saying, that the children are incredible, and they're not. Here's another. One time I was giving a talk about what I had learned about hunter-gatherer children, and somebody in the audience who was a graduate student said that, I'm doing a doctoral dissertation on whining. I have a theory that whining is universal, and that there's the universal ways of whining, and I'm wondering how whining occurs among hunter-gatherer children. So I said, I don't really know. Let me ask a colleague of mine who actually lived with a hunter-gatherer group. And so I asked her, Gilda Morelli is her name, and I said, so what was whining like? And she said, I spent months living with these people and observing children. I don't recall any whining. So they had nothing to whine about. So it's the children are very happy. I also, and it's not, it's interesting. Somehow we in our rich societies, somehow we've created conditions which are uniquely bad for children. I once met, you don't even have to go back to indigenous cultures, but just to even just regular third world countries. I met a woman some years ago who told me she was a native of Kenya. She had grown up in Kenya until the age 16, and she came to the United States at age 16. And she said, the first thing that hit me is how unhappy the children are here compared to back in Kenya. They're poor in Kenya, but they're happy. They're much freer in Kenya than they are here. She also, incidentally, was concerned about the happiness of the dogs here. She said the dogs and the children are all on leashes here. They're free back in Kenya. What have we done? What has been the point of our wealth if we're raising people in ways that don't make them happy?
Sure, and to get to this point, in your work, you talk about the decline of free play. So I think the data is from America. Can you walk us through this decline? When did it begin? And in your opinion, what's the cause of this decline?
So in some sense, I have to start off by saying, if it's not obvious by my appearance, I'm close to 80. So I grew up in the second half of the 20th century. I was a child in the 1950s, and so I've seen firsthand the change I'm talking about, but I'm not relying just on my own perceptions and memories. There are many studies, there's historical studies, there are many ways of showing that over the years from about 1950 until the present time, we have gradually been taking children's freedoms away from them. Gradually enough that people haven't noticed it, or many people haven't noticed it. From one year to the next, we haven't suddenly imprisoned children, but we've imprisoned them gradually by taking one freedom away, or one part of one freedom partly away, and gradually making this change. And so it's only from the perspective of looking at this whole sweep of time from about 1950 until now that we can understand what a huge change it has been. So in the 1950s, when I was a child, first of all, we had school and children were compelled to go to school just as they are today, but school was not anything like the big thing that is now. The school day was roughly as long as it is today, but at least in the elementary schools I went to, the school day was 6 hours long, but we were indoors only 4 of those hours. We had a half-hour recess in the middle of the morning, half-hour recess in the middle of the afternoon, and a full hour at lunch, and we could do whatever we wanted during those times. Some people went home for lunch, but most of us stayed around and just played, and we played whatever we wanted to play. This was in northern Minnesota. We made snow forts and had snowball fights and did all the things that kids do. And other times of the year, we played with knives. Boys carried jackknives in those days. We played games with knives. I mean, you couldn't do any of this stuff in school now. You can't do any of this. And we didn't really have homework. I mean, maybe once in a while in elementary school, a teacher would say, you know, it'd be nice if you write a poem or a story at home and bring it in the next day. But we didn't carry books and worksheets back and forth. There might have been some of the city schools that did that, but it didn't occur in the schools that I attended or in the schools that most children attended in the United States. So gradually school became more and more of a big deal, more time in school. The school year increased by 5 weeks between 1950 and now. But mostly the increase was by virtue of homework. So even when children went home, they weren't free from school. They still had schoolwork to do. So that's part of the change. And then over time, people got the idea, well, children are just kind of wasting time, getting into trouble, causing nuisances when they're free out there. Let's structure their outdoor activities. So let's create adult-led, instead of just having kids go out and play in their own ways, let's have adult-led activities. Let's have Little League Baseball. Let's have, you know, soccer leagues. Let's have this and that. And let's put our children in these activities. And so once again, children are spending, as a result of this, I'm not against these things, but as children are doing these instead of actual play, they're more and more spending time under adult direction, where adults are telling them what to do, how to do it, and they're not learning how to do things themselves, how to solve their own problems. So that's happening. In addition, and this is a change that was occurring gradually, but probably in the United States at least was accelerated in the 1980s. And this was the development of the belief that it's actually dangerous for children to be free outdoors, that we are putting children at risk if we allow them to just go out and play or roam on the streets. I mean, up until about 1980, children walked to school by themselves or bicycled to school. They could go to their friend's house on their own. You didn't have to, as an adult, walk them there or drive them there, which would be more common. It was regarded as safe enough to let children do these kinds of things, although even by 1980, they weren't as free to do these things as they had been before. But in the 1980s, especially, we developed what some people began to call stranger danger. You know, there are strangers out there lurking around every corner who are going to snatch your child away, and we've got to protect our children from that. There were 2 very much publicized cases of child snatching by strangers in the 1980s. 2 out of millions and millions and millions of children being out there, right? So this is a rare occurrence, but of course, once it occurred, it really hit the media hard. and it hit parents hard. And so here, everybody imagine this terrible scene of my little 6-year-old boy might be snatched away and murdered in a gruesome way, as occurred for at least one of these two children. So you began to hear public service announcements on television and the radio saying that, do you know where your child is now? And the implication is, if you didn't, you're a negligent parent. That's something that parents in the past didn't want to know where their kids were, and their kids didn't want their parents to know. But now suddenly you begin to think, I'm a negligent parent if I don't know. And so the view of what is morally proper parenting began to change. And so we began to feel like you have to always keep tabs on your children. Children have to be tracked all the time. There's no privacy for children. There's no freedom for them to do the things, including, with quotation marks around it, naughty things, right? That children kind of, I would argue, need to do to grow up. So these are some of the forces for change. We also developed smaller families, so there was less need to shoo them out of the house just for the sake of the sanity of the mom, right? And because houses were bigger, the children were a little less needy themselves of getting out of the house, as people began to have children somewhat later in life, and women became professionals in the workplace. The attitude about child raising changed from the kind of just use my natural human instincts and what I've learned from my own mom or my own dad, and what I learned from experience growing up with kids, to let me consult the experts about, excuse me, how to be a proper parent. And of course, the experts see it as their job to warn you of all the potential dangers and everything that can go wrong. And so parenting becomes this anxiety-provoking thing, and it becomes work. It becomes a new profession. We talk about parenting as a job rather than as a relationship. And this changes the whole attitude about parenting from one of, well, this is a person who's entered my house and I have to get along with this person, and so on, to this is a person who's my product and I have to figure out how to create the best product that I can out of this person. And that automatically takes the freedom away from the person that you're trying to create.
Really interesting. And do you think, because in the 50s we saw the rise of TV, in the 90s of cell phone, do you think technologies may have had an impact on the decline of free play, or how does technology relate to play more broadly?
So it's very popular today to think that technology is the cause of the anxiety and depression and high suicide rates we're seeing among young people. Yeah, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But what I want to emphasize is that the changes I've been talking about all occurred before the beginning of the 21st century. They all occurred before we had computers. These changes are not the result of technology. These changes are the result of other things that were happening in our social world, and those other things are still occurring. Now, it's interesting to look at, I've recently, in fact, some people might want to look at my recent Substack letters. I've recently started writing on the Substack platform a series of letters that I'm calling Play Makes Us Human. And in my recent letters, I charted the changes in suicide rate among teenagers, and it's primarily teenage boys because girls rarely actually commit suicide. So it's primarily boys. And what the graph shows is that between 1950 and 1990, there was a huge and continuous increase in the rate of suicides among boys. Also a rise for girls, although not nearly so large and not nearly so steep. but the rise occurred for both boys and girls, reaching a peak in 1990, interestingly. And then it actually started to go down for a while, the suicide rate. And so I've been writing about why that might be. So between 1950 and 1990, all these changes that I've just described occurred. We were gradually taking childhood away from children. We were gradually making life less interesting, and maybe especially for boys, because, you know, I don't think it's sexist to say that boys on average, there are certainly differences, boys on average suffer more if they're deprived from outdoor adventure, from doing risky things, from taking that kind of control. That is the case for girls. Girls seem to be more able to adapt to those kinds of things, which is why I think that the rise in suicides was greater for boys than for girls. I think that's at least part of the explanation. Now, what happened in 1990? This is the question that actually I'm going to be writing in my next Substack post. What happened in 1990 to bring the suicide rate down? It began to descend almost as rapidly as it was going up. That descent didn't last very long. But between about 1990 and about 2005, the suicide rate was dropping considerably for boys and to a lesser degree for girls. And I am asking the question, what happened then? Now, there's various possible answers to that. But the answer that I think makes most sense is technology. Suddenly, boys had something interesting to do. Even if they were not allowed to go outdoors, they could mess around with these computers. Boys were the early adopters of computers. They in fact, in some sense, invented the damn thing, right? This was play. And as soon as there were video games, even violent video games, wow, this is exciting. I can't go out and pretend I'm violent in the real world, but I can, at least in this virtual world, I can be a fierce individual. I could go about murdering people in pretense. This is all pretense, which has nothing to do with reality, but it's pretense, which is important. So boys now had something exciting to do. They had something to talk with one another about. And then the games became multiplayer games and online. And so we had kind of destroyed what used to be called the culture of childhood. And now, in a sense, it was recreated. It was now an online culture of childhood. You made friends online. You interacted online. You played exciting games online. And when you weren't online and you were together in the real world, maybe between classes at school, you had something to talk about again that you didn't have before. I think it makes complete sense that this was the primary reason why depression, suicide declined, especially among boys, beginning around 1990 and continuing into the early 21st century. Now, what happened after that to cause a rise again, I'm less certain about. It may be that the other kinds of factors were just catching up. It may be that the excitement about all this online thing began to wear off a little bit. It may be that parents began to want to control that, so boys were no longer as free to do these online things as they were before. Who knows what it is? I think it's a combination of things. But the rates of anxiety, depression, suicide began once again to rise, such that there are now almost, not quite, but almost back to what they were in 1990. Now, people act as if this is a brand new thing to see such high rates of anxiety and depression and anxiety among children, but it's not. We saw it in 1990. This is just, in some sense, springing back to what we were there. This is not, so people, here's the way I think of it. You know, it's, in my mind, anybody who opens their eyes, anybody who is willing to be open-minded about this is going to have to admit that if you take play away from children, if you deprive them of the freedom to explore and do things on their own, you're going to make them depressed, right? I mean, isn't that obvious? There's a a famous play researcher, Brian Sutton Smith, who died a few years ago, but he used to say the opposite of play is not work, it's depression. So of course, if you take play away from children, if you make them do all this stuff in school and they're always trying, and you're constantly evaluating them and measuring them, of course, that's also going to create anxiety. Of course it is. Why wouldn't it? But we don't want to admit that. Nobody wants to say that our schools are part of the problem or that our manner of overprotecting our children are part of the problem. We don't want to say that because that's pointing the finger at ourselves. That's saying we need some big social changes, and those are hard to make, so we deny that. Or we don't admit it, we ignore it. We ignore the elephant in the room here, and instead we look for something else. And what else might we look at? Well, we look at technology. Ah, that's new. That must be it. And we see that kids are making a lot of use. For a while, people were actually saying that video games were doing this to people. Now nobody says that anymore. Very few, still some people will say it, but most people don't, because the evidence is overwhelming that video games are having way more positive effects than negative effects. The kids who play video games are happier than those who don't. The kids who play video games are acquiring skills and creativity that kids who don't play video games aren't acquiring. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming. So now the new demon is social media. So people want to blame social media because there's not so much research about that. And there's a little bit of research showing some correlation, especially for girls, between the amount of use of social media and their level of anxiety. On average, girls who use social media are a little more anxious than those who don't. So people want to now say, well, that's the demon. Let's ban social media. Let's take away the iPhones from kids so that they can't use social media anymore. But I think I think there may be some evidence for that, and there may be some reason for teaching young people about the potential downfalls of social media. You know, don't use it in certain ways. Be reasonable about use of time. You know, don't spend all your time on this. Maybe have some timeouts from it. You know, I think young people are reasonable, and we can reason with them. We don't have to dictatorially say you're not allowed to use social media, or you're not allowed to have an iPhone. I mean, imagine taking cell phones. I mean, would you want somebody to take the cell phone away from you? I certainly wouldn't. I mean, this is the greatest tool ever invented in the history of humanity. I mean, and certainly educationally, it's the greatest tool. I've learned so much from my cell phone. You know, I'm ranting here, but you know, I'll go out for a walk and I'll see a tree that I don't know what it is. And in the past, I would say, well, it's a tree. I don't know what it is. Now I aim my camera at it. I set up my little app that's a tree identifier app. I take a picture of that tree. Ah, here's what the tree is, and it tells me a little bit about the tree. I've now developed a whole realm of knowledge and curiosity that was completely foreign to me before. Kids do the same thing. This is an incredible tool for them for all kinds of purposes. Do we want to take that away from them? No. If there's some ways that they're using technology that is harmful to them, let's try to help them figure that out. And let's try to caution them. It's a little bit like the difference between when I was a kid, we recognized that there's danger if you live in a city, there's danger from traffic. And back then, instead of saying, because there's danger from traffic, I'm not going to allow you outdoors without being with you, we said, I'm going to teach you how to deal with traffic. Don't go running out into the street. Look both ways when you cross the street. Cross the street where there's a traffic light. We taught safety measures. If there was some fear about dangers, about strangers, we didn't say, I'm not allowing you outdoors because there's dangerous people out there. We said, you know, look, there are some dangerous people out there. Most people are wonderful. They're very kind and they're helpful, and you can ask them for help and they'll give you directions. And if you need something, ask a stranger. But there are some weirdos out there, you know. And if somebody asks you to get in their car or tries to entice you in their car with candy, say no. If they pull you and scream at the top of your lungs. You know, this is safety advice. And we need maybe to give some safety advice about social media. I don't know exactly what that advice would be, but among other things, you know, for God's sake, don't send naked pictures of yourself. You know, don't do anything on the internet that you wouldn't want a future employer to see, right? So that's these are some of the things that kids need to be cautioned about.
Yeah, sure. I agree. There's tremendous benefits to these technologies. One of the problem I find, because I'm working with the young people that are using social media, is that sometimes some social media apps like Instagram, I don't know myself quite well how to handle it, because it's quite addictive, and there's a lot of adults that are themselves addicted to these platforms, and so it's very difficult, because we tell young people to handle these social media as well, but we don't know ourselves quite well how to handle them, because we're in some kind of asymmetric. There's like an asymmetry of power between the user and the platform that is gathering a lot of information about us, and that just wants us to stay more time on the platform. And we ourselves, well, we don't know exactly what we want, but we don't want to spend all of our day on social media. So it's like an asymmetric relationship that can be a bit dangerous, and that's why it's very important, I think, to tell young people about those potential negative effects, and to try to handle them better.
Right, and I agree with that. And certainly it's in the interest of the social media, you know, people who create it, to keep people involved and interested in it. But sometimes people talk about as if there's some kind of magic there. There's some kind of power there, that they have some way of making you addicted that is as powerful as heroin would make you addicted. And that's simply not true. That's just not true. The technology of behavior control, you know, is just not as powerful as people pretend that it is. You can resist it, but you've got to want to resist it. You've got to decide to resist it. I know a therapist who works with people who claim, mostly young people, who claim that they have an addiction to some. At first it was people who claimed they had an addiction to video games, and now I think it may be people who say they have an addiction to social media. And he says, as he talks with them, as they sit down together, he says, so tell me about it. And they'll talk about how they're using whatever it is, whether it's video games or social media or something, and why it's being called addiction. He says, so let's, in order to have a reasonable, rational discussion, let's not use the word addiction. That pathologizes it. This is not an addiction. This is a time management problem. This is not like you were on heroin. There's no physical withdrawal effect here. You know, you can stop it anytime you want. You're not going to suffer from stopping. You can do it. We all have time management problems. You know, Peter Gray, I have a time management problem. I want to spend all my time outdoors. I am, quote, addicted to the damn outdoors. I never want to come in and do my writing and my research. I want to be outdoors. So I have a time management problem. So I allow myself a certain amount of time outdoors. And then I say, when that's done, I have to come in and get on the damn screen and do my writing, right? So maybe my addiction is maybe, if I call it that, but it's not healthy to call it an addiction. This is just something I like to do, and is attractive to me, and so on and so forth. And let's not pretend it's an addiction. And the same is true with the screens. There's nothing addictive about it, except unless we're just expanding the word addiction to mean this is something I like to do, and so it's hard for me to stop doing it, right? So that's the that's the first step towards solving this problem. And then the second step is talking rationally. I know, so part of my research is to study people in democratic schools and learning centers, where the children make their own decisions about what they're doing, and the children make the rules and so on. There's one learning center that I have visited and been involved with where the children make the rules, And they themselves made a rule that there would be 2 hours every day that they're there in this school or this learning center, where nobody's going to be on the computer. Nobody's going to be on a knife. Everybody has to put the technology away. This came from the children themselves. And why did they make this rule? Because some of the children said, so one of the things that's happened here in our school is that it's hard to get a real game going outdoors. It involves a number of us together. We want to get up a soccer game or a baseball game or something outdoors. And everybody's saying, oh, I'll be out there in a few minutes as soon as I finish what I'm doing here on my computer. And so therefore, unlike before we had all these computers, kids aren't gathering in a group to play the game. So they said, so this is a problem. So let's solve the problem by let's say for 2 hours, that shouldn't be too much of a sacrifice. Nobody's going to be on the computer. And they agreed to that. And so, because it came from the kids and it was rational and it recognized the fact that you can give it up. It's not, there's no physical withdrawal effect if you stop. This was a fine solution to what was a time management problem at that school, and what was creating some difficulty in getting a big enough group of kids outdoors to play something. I can imagine within a family that it would make a lot of sense to say, hey, look, we're all kind of on our own little devices here. It's kind of segregating us as a family member. We're not doing much together as a family. Let's say that there's going to be certain times of the day when none of us, and that applies to the parents as well as the kids, are going to be on our devices. We're going to eat a meal together. We're going to maybe have an hour after that meal when none of us are being distracted by social media or video games or computers or even television, where we're just together. And that's a very rational decision. And I think almost everybody turns out to be happy when that decision is made, unless you happen to be in a very unhappy family where you don't really want to be with the other people in the family, but that's a different story. So I really object to this idea that this is some kind of a trap, that these magical social media companies have trapped children into, and the only way out of the trap is to ban it.
To talk about education more broadly, a lot of people talk about the fact that we're kind of in the middle of an education crisis. I talked recently with Zach Stein. You may know him. He's an education philosopher. And we talked about why our obsession with measurement, like in standardized testing, can be at the root of many of our problems. In your opinion, how does measurement affect education?
Well, I think that you've put your finger on a huge part of the problem, that the more we have become obsessed with measurement, the worse schools have become. The more anxiety-provoking they've become, the less actual real learning occurs. So first of all, measurement implies standardization. If you're going to measure things, that means you've got some standard unit of measurement, right? I have long argued that education is not measurable. How do you possibly measure education? How do you possibly what is education? Education, to me, by my definition, education is everything that a person learns that helps them in their path of life. But we've all got different paths of life that helps them become what they want to become, right? So my education and your education are two entirely different things. Not entirely different. There are certain overlaps. Probably for both of us, we both feel like it's good to know how to read. You know, that helps us in life. It's good to know how to write so we can communicate that way. It's certainly good to have a grasp of English or French or maybe both for some people, right? It's certainly good to have those things. But beyond that, and beyond certain things that are important to human beings everywhere, the kinds of things that can't be taught in school, such as how to get along well with other people, how to control our emotions so we're not overridden by fear and anger, you know, how to make friends, how to do the things that really are the things that create happiness. None of this can be taught. It all has to be learned, and I've argued the primary way you learn it is in play. So, but beyond that, these other things that are tested in school, they may be important for some people, but totally irrelevant to other people. You know, another way of thinking of this, there may have been a time way back when the whole educational system was established, when there was a finite amount of knowledge out there in the world. And you could kind of pretend that that schools are teaching this knowledge, that this is the knowledge that's out there in the world, and schools are teaching this knowledge. But now that's an absurd claim in today's world. There's so much knowledge. There are so many paths in life. There's so many different skills that nobody can learn more than a tiny sliver of it, right? And why should we all be learning the same sliver? What on earth gives the people who create the curriculum in school the right to say this is the sliver that everybody's supposed to learn? That's absurd when you think about it. Why on earth should everybody be learning, let's say, how to solve a quadratic equation when nobody out there in the real world is dealing with quadratic equations? Nobody, maybe one person in a million, right? You know, what on earth kind of sense does that make? Why not let people learn what they want to learn? And let's create a learning environment in which people can figure out what's out there and learn what they want to learn. And that is easier today than it has ever been before because of technology, precisely because of this thing that everybody's so afraid of. Because of technology, everybody has access to all the knowledge in the world in some sense, right? Everybody has access to the real experts out there. You don't have to learn it from a teacher who's droning on about stuff that the teacher doesn't really understand. You can go to your YouTube and you can go to a YouTube of some physicist. You can learn from the real experts out there. And it's self-directed, and you don't have to learn that if you're not interested in it. You can learn this if you're interested in it. The education, the world is ripe for self-directed education, and there are people proving that. There are people who are unschoolers. There are people who are going to democratic schools where they're in charge of their learning. And this has been going on now long enough that there are many adults out there doing well in the world who didn't go to typical schools. And I've been studying them, and they have what are commonly called 21st century skills. They're entrepreneurs, they're creative, they are inventors, they are resilient, they're adaptive, they can learn on the job. They have all of these things because this is the way they've grown up. So we're living in a world where we need self-directed and creative people. And yet we have an educational system that has moved ever farther away from creating self-directed and educational purpose. And that's largely because of our obsession with measurement. We measure everybody with the same measures, and therefore we prevent people from spending much time developing anything that's outside the realm of those measures.
One last question, because I think we are running out of time. Is there some an educational model that you think about that you think is the most interesting out there?
Well, so I've long been writing and talking about the educational model that I call, and many others now call, self-directed education, with capital S-D-E, self-directed. education. This is really the same educational model that applied to hunter-gatherer children. Nobody told hunter-gatherer children what they have to learn, but rather what the adults in the society did. And it was easy in a hunter-gatherer culture because everybody was together. The children could see what adults do. Children were exposed to the whole culture. The assumption was children would on their own, through their own curiosity, their play, their sociability, they would learn what they want to learn. They would learn what they need to learn to be ultimately adults in that society. That's the way education will work through almost all of human existence. What my research shows, based on studies of democratic schools where children have the same freedoms that hunter-gatherer children had, and opportunities appropriate to our culture to learn what you need to know to do well in the culture, but no coercion, no pushing to do it, no testing, freedom for children to pursue their curiosity and to play and to socialize and to develop their own ideas and creativity and share those ideas with one another in a free environment. I've determined that that works. When I first got involved with this, I was skeptical, like many people might be skeptical, but I became convinced from my research of people who are doing this that it works. And so it's a very simple model of education. It says we don't have to teach children. We don't have to educate children. What we have to do is provide the conditions in which they can learn. We have to provide conditions in which children can see what the skills are that are important, where people are really using those skills, where they're in an age-mixed environment, they can interact with other people, children who are a little older than themselves who have these skills. I've learned, for example, that children who can't read, if they're playing with children who can read, learn to read because they're playing with children who can read. Children who can't throw a ball learn how to throw a ball because they're playing with children who can throw a ball. This is the way hunter-gatherer children learned, but we deprive children of that because we segregate them by age. We don't let them play anymore. So what we do. So children come into the world biologically designed to educate themselves. Their curiosity, their amazing, remarkable curiosity drives them to want to know things, to want to understand things. And we put them in schools that kill it because their curiosity doesn't count anymore. The only thing that counts is the damn tests. And that's not something that every single child is curious about, right? At any given time. So we kill curiosity. Every child wants to play, and they play in ways that develop human skills. But play is a distraction in our schools, so we forbid it except at recess. And we, at least in the United States, have even ever less recess. And recess even is governed in ways that restrict the ways that you can actually play during recess. So we take away children's natural ways of educating themselves, and then we try to use reward and punishment to make them learn what we've decided they should learn. What a ridiculous system. What a stupid thing we are doing. You know, the only way you can understand it is historically. Nobody would come up with this system because it made sense. It's just historical. It made sense back in the 18th century, you know, when all of this started, and when we believed that the primary purpose of education was to drive this willfulness out of people because that was the source of the devil and make them obey authority. And that was the original purpose of schools. But then we began to think of them as educational institutions in a broader sense. But they don't work. They've never worked. And they especially don't work today.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Peter, for your time. Your work is really inspiring, and this discussion was deeply interesting, and I'm sure people will find some value in it.
All right, it's been a pleasure talking with you.